I can best clip it to where it won't crackle. Try that. That seems to be okay. For me?
Yep.
Just before we start, can you get this done?
Good evening and welcome to the final part of our Lent talks. Over the past 4 weeks, we saw wonderful illustrations of Jesus' journey to the cross and his death. Tonight is no exception, and I'm sure we will leave here with all the illustrations embedded in our mind over the Easter holidays and beyond. I introduce to you Iain for our last session, and I'm sure that he is going to make this final one more special than the others. Welcome, Iain.
Thank you. Well, I'll try. It's good to be with you again, and in case I don't get a chance to say so at the end, I've thoroughly enjoyed meeting you all, so it's been very pleasant to come down from Hatfield to Harrow and discover a different bit of Harrow, because before they were married, my son-in-law used to live a little bit further south in Harrow than here. So I never quite got to North Harrow, though I kind of drove through it quite a bit on the way. So we come to the last one. Not quite the end of Good Friday, because we don't get to the actual burial of Jesus, but we get to a very particular moment in the story. Again, one that isn't in the Gospels as such, and so it's a little bit of imaginative thinking around the core of the Gospel story. But moving on slightly from last week when we saw the body of Jesus being taken down from the cross. We've also this evening got the most famous work of art of the five by the most famous artist of the five. It's possibly one of the most famous works of art. It's probably up there with the Mona Lisa as the one that more people would recognize than not. But does that mean it's well known? Well, no, it's recognized, but probably not very well understood. And I hope by the end of the evening you'll understand it a bit better and why I've chosen to end here. So, next slide, please. So, we're thinking about compassion, partly because it's a possible translation of the Italian word Pieta, which is the shorthand version of the name of the sculpture we're going to look at. But also I want to take it in a very original sense of suffering with someone, the sense of actual intimacy and closeness, and see how that actually is built into this work of art and can be built into Christian discipleship too. Next slide, please. And as ever, I invite you to join with me in this simple traditional prayer. We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you in this church and in all the churches of the world, because by your holy cross you have redeemed the world. Next slide, please. So there it is, the famous Michelangelo Pieta. That's how you'd see it if you go to St. Peter's, with all the sort of marbling on the wall behind it. And of course, what you can't see in the photograph, but is rather obvious if you go there, is the thick bulletproof glass paneling and security systems to stop you getting anywhere near. That all as a result, some of you might remember, in the early 1970s when somebody sadly, when there was no security around it, actually took a hammer to it and broke off Mary's nose and her left arm. You can't tell from looking now, even in very detailed photographs, because she was very skillfully restored. I'll mention some of the other damage and things a bit later in the talk. But we're going to look not at this image, but a slightly different photograph. So next slide, please. So that's, with all the background stripped away, we'll spend just 5 minutes having a close study and reflection on the Pieta. Right. So, the question is, it's undoubtedly an incredibly skillful piece of work, but why does it look the way it does? What is the message that Michelangelo is trying to share with us? That's the real question. Next slide, please. So we're now going to look at a little bit of background and then go back to the sculpture and work our way round and just see the meaning and the message that's actually put into the work. Next slide, please. So, the artist, as I mentioned, is Michelangelo Buonarroti. He's born in 1475 in a place called Caprese, which was, it's a very small town at the time. It's within territory that was controlled by the city of Florence, and his father was the local civil servant, the sort of in charge of the village appointed by the authorities in Florence. So he's not poor, but he's not rich either. The family saw themselves as kind of shabby genteel and had some rather fanciful family tree that traced them back to somebody incredibly important 200 or 300 years previous, which is highly dubious, but they believed it, which is the really important thing. So Michelangelo always saw himself as a bit of a gentleman and liked to be treated as if he was. He was part of this movement where artists are struggling to be recognized as intellectuals and artists in our terms, not as craftsmen. So this is not like the bloke who comes and builds an extension for you, which is to some extent how artists in earlier periods seem to have been treated. The family moved back to Florence and he started training as an artist from about 1487 and partly within the Medici household. He was invited to go and work there, and I'll say a little bit more about the significance of that in a moment. But it was a really good development because his father got a better job out of it as well. Because the Medici, although technically they often held no formal office in the government of Florence, were so incredibly rich that they kind of ran everything. And, well, if you didn't do what they wanted, somebody would go have a quiet word and help you see why you were wrong. They made all the money in banking. Throughout his artistic career, and you'll see he lived, if you do the sums, he lived to a ripe old age, really, and was active to within a year or so of his death. He alternated between being based in Florence and in Rome, so the vast majority of his work was in one place or the other, and the last sort of 30 years or so of his life he was in Rome. He was a poet, a painter, a sculptor, and an architect, and people tend to know about the middle two. They know about the Pieta and they know about the Sistine Chapel, sculpture and painting. What people often don't know is that he was a prolific poet. Some of the poetry is a little bit rough, apparently. I mean, my Italian, certainly my Tuscan Italian of the 16th century is not up to making a formal judgment on that. But some of it is really rather good, and he knew a lot of poets and moved in very particular circles, and so yes, there's a lot of poetry, and also as an architect in Florence and Rome. In fact, if you go to St. Peter's, the most obvious sign of his work is the building that you're in, not the Pieta, because he was one of the major architects working on that basilica in the period. He was a very personally devout man, and this is one of the things that the art history books tend to skate over, but very personally devout. He was in fact a Third Order Franciscan, as were quite a number of artistic people at the time and previously, both literary and in terms of visual art. It's not something he would ever have shouted about, but he would have lived by some form of simple rule of life. He never splashed the cash, although he earned a lot. He lived a very sort of basic, simple life devoted to his art and to his vocation as he saw it. And the other really interesting thing, he's very closely connected with reform movements in the Catholic Church, with what you might call, ahead of Martin Luther and all that sort of thing. You must never think that the urge to reform the church began one day when an idea popped into Martin Luther's head in Germany. People had been talking about the church being in need of major reform for a very long time beforehand. It's just they weren't all as stroppy by nature as Luther and inclined to pick fights. And so there were a lot of people working for reform. It's like people assume that Martin Luther's German Bible was the first time the Bible had been translated into German. In the previous 30, 40, 50 years, there'd been something like 20 to 30 versions of the Bible in German before Luther. He did a Bible in German because he wasn't quite happy with the other ones. Plus he was locked up in a castle, hiding from arrest. And what else do you do when you're a New Testament scholar? So there's a very strong current of reform running through the Western Church at this time. And Michelangelo was part of a rather intellectual elite, radical sort of group. From really quite early in his life, it's part of what was going on in the Medici household. Next slide, please. That's not a self-portrait. It's meant to be a portrait of Michelangelo by a much younger artist who did know him. And it looks quite a lot like some of the supposed self-portraits that do creep into things like the Last Judgment on the wall of the Sistine Chapel. Next slide, please. So the sculpture itself, it was commissioned in Rome in the initial conversations of 1497. Now, when you work that out, that means that Michelangelo was quite young, like 22, not long in Rome, but had a reputation as a very talented young sculptor, which is why he was in Rome anyway. And he was commissioned by a French cardinal, Jean Belair de la Guaylas from Gascony, but who was one of the most senior people in the French state, not just in the French church. And the cardinal was in Rome because he was the ambassador from the King of France to the papal court and had been for a number of years. So a very wealthy, well-connected, important person, a Rome VIP. And the cardinal commissioned it for his tomb, because if you wait until you're dead, you can't choose what's done. So if you want to make sure you have a fitting memorial and you're that sort of person, you start to draw your pension and then think, I better get this sorted out. So he commissioned Michelangelo in 1497 to produce a sculpture to go on his tomb in the chapel of Santa Petronilla in Old St. Peter's. So at this time, if you went to Rome, it was the original kind of ancient basilica, the first one that had been built in the sort of 4th century, that was still standing just about. And so the statue isn't in its original position. So it was meant to go on the cardinal's tomb in St. Petronilla's chapel. Who was St. Petronilla? She's not a kind of household name. She was possibly legendary. She was meant to be St. Peter's daughter, who had also been martyred in Rome in the 1st century. Probably not true, but that's who she was supposed to be. And it was a chapel that was very much associated with the French royal family. So it was a very prestigious place to be buried. And having received the commission, Michelangelo went to Carrara, which is just inland in the sort of northwest of Tuscany, where all the great marble quarries were. he'd been before, and he went because he wasn't just doing a mail order service and getting any old rubbishy lump of stone being sent. This was a big deal, and he was going to personally select the exact block of stone that had to be flawless. So he will have spent some time going there, sorting it all out. And it is a big sculpture. It's 1.74 metres by 1.95 metres, so the figures are life-size or even a bit bigger than life, especially Mary. The Cardinal died in 1499, and the sculpture was finished, which was sadly something that he never quite achieved any time later on. There's a huge number of unfinished Michelangelo sculptures. But this one was done, and it was installed, it was ready to go in. So he will have worked on this and nothing else, flat out, hard physical work for about 2 years. Even the final finish polishing will have taken months, and most of it he will have done himself, though he probably had some assistance. Because when you finish carving with your chisels, the surface isn't smooth. To get it smooth, you've got to kind of rub it, and you have to get things like finely ground pumice stone and literally rub it across the surface to get that sort of really silky finish, which this statue in particular really has. So it's a huge amount of physical labour with all the peril that goes with carving stone. Because you can have been carving for 18 months, and then on the last day, you're just doing the finishing touches on the face, and someone says, "Coffee," and you go, "What?" And then you notice the nose has fallen off. It's quite hard to stick it back on. So there's a lot of anxiety around something like this, especially carving the delicate bits, fingers and so on. Next slide, please. So the contract was formally signed in 1498, and it specifies what he's got to produce. A draped figure of the Virgin Mary with the dead Christ in her arms, the figures being life-sized. It shall be more beautiful than any work in marble to be seen in Rome today, and such that no master of our own time shall be able to produce a better. So no pressure there, young man. You know, I want the best and most beautiful statue in Rome, which has more statues than you could shake a stick at, by great masters of the past, and it's going to be unsurpassable by anybody alive today. But he probably got what he paid for. It's interesting that he has to specify exactly what he wants, because in central Italy this was not that common a subject. Next slide, please. So this is what he got, and we now have to see why this is such a special piece of sculpture. And it's not just the skill with a hammer and chisels and the ability the sort of obsessive dedication to get the finish on the whole thing. Next slide, please. So we need to think a little bit more about Michelangelo and his understanding of art and faith. So I mentioned the significance of him being assigned to the Medici household. This incredibly wealthy banking family had the money to do almost anything they wanted. And fascinatingly, what they wanted was to bring together almost like a personal university. They paid for and accommodated all sorts of leading intellectuals, creative people, artistic people, poets, historians, all sorts, all came together to live in their extended household. They had a library provided, they would all have shared meals together, walked around the garden, talking about poetry and theology. And amongst some of the names that Michelangelo as a teenager will have had dinner with regularly, chatted about life and so on, There was Cristoforo Landino, who knew everything there was to know about Dante. Marsilio Ficino, who was a philosopher, but also wrote commentaries on the letters of St. Paul. He translated from Greek Plato and Plotinus, philosophers of the ancient world. So these people can speak Latin, they can speak Greek, they can speak Italian, some of them are learning Hebrew. It's an exciting, new, creative place to be. It's not like a dull, old-fashioned medieval university, which had got a bit ossified. This is a lively, creative place that people would have been desperate to get into. There was Poliziano, a poet who translated from the Greek the works of Homer, the great epic poems. And then there were church people around, including, I suppose, the most famous name, the reforming Dominican Girolamo Savonarola, who, the Medici knew who they wanted at San Marco, and since they'd built it and paid for it, they got their choice. So the Dominican house in Florence, the prior was this man Savonarola, who was a radical, exciting, reform-minded intellectual who ended up being burnt at the stake, but that was a few years after. Because I think partly he went a bit weird and partly he went a bit too far too fast. But these would have been incredibly exciting people to be around, and their ideas really shaped the way Michelangelo saw life and saw the church, saw faith, and what art would contribute to it. Next slide, please. So the general principles that he picks up was, first of all, that the church was just generally in need of a reform. It was rotten, it was corrupt, people weren't being taught properly, it was too worldly, people were ignorant, the whole thing needed to be fired up. And ultimately they thought it rested on poor scholarship because the clergy were thick, they didn't understand, they didn't read Greek, they didn't read Hebrew, some of them weren't that hot on Latin either. And they were relying on, Holy Church teachers because it's come down from authorities in the past. Whereas these people said, you have to think for yourself. You have to say, this is what they said 100 years ago, is it right? Not just accept it because it was an long-standing idea. And they also thought in particular that Christian art had somehow lost touch with the mission of the church, that it had become too worldly, too emotional and sensational, and that artists increasingly were using it to show off. It was all about, look what I can do, rather than putting their talent at the service of the church and saying, what do you need me to do? So Michelangelo, as a very talented young sculptor, came to see his vocation, really, to purify and renew Christian art. And as ever, that means partly looking backwards to try and find a Christian art that he could take as a starting point if the previous generation, the immediate past, was wrong. And what he tended to fasten on was Giotto, who was the great Florentine artist working at pretty much the same time as Duccio that we saw last week, around the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century. Giotto and Dante and Petrarch and various other major Italian figures were, surprise, surprise, also third-order Franciscans. And so it was very natural for Michelangelo to come into a kind of Franciscan orbit. And a lot of his ideas fit very nicely with Franciscan ideas. Not that he just hung around with Franciscans, mind you. But also, the word for the kind of intellectual movement, I suppose, that the Medici household was part of is humanist. Now, the trouble is, these days, everybody in churches goes, because that we take now to mean atheist, but in this period it doesn't mean that at all. The vast majority of the people there were very devout, practicing Christians. It was a way of approaching just making sense and understanding the world, understanding God, understanding the Bible. It was a new way of doing things rather than throwing it all out because they didn't believe in it. It's only much later that the word humanist starts to mean what we now tend to mean by it. But in this period, it's just about being part of this new intellectual movement. People like Erasmus, and in this country, Thomas More, they're all part of this great sort of international move to change things in the church and revitalize and start again. And Michelangelo is the sculptor and painter that puts himself into this group and devotes himself to the same aims that they had. Next slide, please. Much later on, in 1548, there's a fascinating sort of, well, it depends what you're fascinated by, really, but there's an author in Rome called Francisco de Holanda, published in Michelangelo's lifetime dialogues with Michelangelo. And these are kind of literary compositions, but based on real conversations that he'd overheard or been part of. And Michelangelo had a bit of a temper and, you know, wouldn't have taken this lightly if it had been gross misrepresentation. So although it's not verbatim something he said, it seems very much to represent his ideas. First of all, Michelangelo in the dialogues, when he's asked about what makes a good painting, has a go at all the religious art from Northern Europe at the time, which he says is sort of silly, sentimental, emotional stuff, and it's too worldly and it doesn't mean anything and it will only please people who are very shallow in their Christian faith. But he said, you know, the really good art is from Italy, and the best of it, well, the qualities that it has, he says, with wise persons, nothing causes devotion to be remembered or to arise more than the difficulty of the perfection which unites itself with and joins God. And then good painting is a music and melody which intellect only can appreciate, and with great difficulty. There's this emphasis on difficulty. It's got to be hard. You've got to wrestle with it. It's got to be really profound stuff, and you've got to approach it with your head, not just with your heart. And so you can see this right from the very beginning, right in the Pieta. This is a difficult piece to unpick, and you know, lots of the intellectual elite in Rome will have loved spotting things and seeing things that the average person was completely oblivious to. But for Michelangelo, this is what it has to be. This is your humanist Christian art, and it's an art of the whole person, and you have to work at understanding it. Next slide, please. This is a bit of his poetry, which also gives you an insight into what he thought he was doing. Again, it's a bit later in life, but he does seem to have carried these ideas right the way through. So this is a double sestet written in Italian. I put the Italian tiny on that side because I'm not sure. I mean, if you're desperate to know what it's all about, you can buy copies of Michelangelo's poetry. It's all in print. It's written about 1541 or so. It's written for someone called Vittoria Colonna, who was a very, very aristocratic Roman lady, widowed tragically very early in life, never remarried, but then she spent a lot of time hanging around religious communities and making friends with all sorts of incredibly intellectual and talented people and introducing them to one another, and kind of, I suppose in a much later age, she would have had a salon and soiree and that sort of thing, but this was all a bit more straightforward and rather more devout than that. I mean, So she became a good friend of Michelangelo, and he wrote poems for her, but it's not kind of romantic. They were also, incidentally, both of them really good friends with Reginald Pole, who became Archbishop of Canterbury in this country under Mary Tudor, and he was very much part of the reforming Catholic movement. Nearly got to be Pope, actually, one vote short. How history would have changed. So anyway, he says, "From birth I was given beauty as a faithful guide to my vocation. It is a light and mirror for me in both the arts, painting and sculpture. If anyone thinks otherwise, he's quite mistaken. This alone carries the eye to those heights which here I set myself to paint and sculpt. If those of rash and foolish judgment drag down beauty to the senses, Flemish artists, though it moves and carries every healthy mind to heaven, let them realize that eyes that are infirm do not move from the mortal to the divine sphere, but remain forever firmly fixed there, down here, where to think of rising without grace is a vain hope." There's all sorts you could draw from that, but fundamentally his idea is that beautiful things in this world naturally lead to beauty itself with a capital B, i.e. God. So it's the beautiful things will carry the healthy mind to heaven, so that when you contemplate a work of art or a beautiful bit of nature, you should immediately be drawn in and through that thing to contemplate God, the ultimately beautiful one. And if you don't, if you just see beauty as something that it's fun and it's nice and it's pretty to look at and decorative, then you're totally missing the point. So his art, he wants to have great beauty in order to lead people to God. Next slide, please. So that's what ultimately this sculpture is about. It's his first really big, important chance to do something incredibly beautiful to draw people closer to God. And also to do something which is going to draw on to understand it, and to understand where its beauty is taking you, you're going to have to work hard, and you're going to have to use your head, not just your eyes. Next slide, please. So we're going to look a bit deeper at what he's actually done here now. Next slide. So the source for all this, as I say, it's not a particular verse in the Bible. The source is really what tends to be called by art historians Andachtsbilder, German for devotional images, basically. Why we can't speak English, I don't know, but it sounds clever. And the thing is, it's not Italian or French, because most of these images, the origin seems to be in what would now be Holland, Belgium, Germany. This is down the Rhine Valley to the sea, where a lot of the most wealthy and important cities in Northern Europe were, and where people had the money to pay for things like devotional images. So they could be painted, they could be sculpture. Later on, they're printed. So what they do, these devotional images, instead of being great big, they tend to be small scale, often domestic. They're meant to be in someone's home, perhaps in a little private chapel or an oratory or a corner of your front room that you could use for saying private prayers. And what they tend to do, it's almost like a film where you go from the wide shot where you see the full narrative scene, and then they zoom in on one person, and it picks out one little part of the biblical story and then presents it for you as a focus for prayer and devotion. And the development of them is very much tied in with all sorts of interesting medieval sort of 14th, 15th century religious movements, like one called Devotio Moderna, which is Latin for sort of modern worship, modern devotion. It was aimed very much at inspiring people who were not members of religious communities or were not ordained to really embrace their Christian faith and live it out, to help people understand how you could be a devout, prayerful person without having to live like a monk or a nun. And there were books written and there was art produced. And it fits into that sort of world. So Northern Europe was very familiar with it. Italy a bit less so, except in northern Italy, along the cities of the Po Valley from Venice onwards, which were very, very connected with Germany because they were the jumping off point to go over the Alps, and all the goods from the Eastern Mediterranean would come up through places like Venice, off the ships onto pack horses and wagons, and then over the Brenner Pass down to places like Munich, Nuremberg, and so on. And artists would travel both ways on the same journeys. So northern Italy is much closer to Germany than Tuscany and Rome. Next slide, please. So that's just a quick example. It's a small sort of painting, and you can see in the background there's all sorts of little details, instruments of the Passion, people being negative about Jesus, lots of hand gestures representing the different attitudes you could have to Jesus. And then we have the dead body of Jesus supported by Mary. One or two odd things about the body of Jesus, but we'll get to those later. Next slide, please. This is from northern Italy, Andrea Mantegna, and from the text in the top corners, we know that this is the moment when the crowd are shouting, "Crucify him!" And we can see that he's just been tortured, he's about to be taken off, he's been whipped, he's going to be taken to the cross, and we're asked just to stop and think. You know, do we join the crowd that shouts "Crucify," or are we with him and focus in on the suffering of Jesus for our sake? Next slide, please. This is a slightly bigger and more expensive upmarket version with more figures in by Bellini from Venice, again with the body of Jesus taken down from the cross and then held up for our contemplation. Next slide, please. This is a sort of international Gothic style by Jean Maluel. Next slide, please. And a Pieta sculpture. This is a German one from a church in Cologne, where again you've got Mary with the body of Jesus just before it's buried, just after it's been taken down from the cross, and people imagine that she would have got close to the body in some sort of way, and traditionally the body of Jesus is shown on her knees, and we'll think why in a few minutes. So this is the kind of tradition of small-scale devotional images, mainly in people's homes, but sometimes in churches, not as the setting for a big liturgical thing, a celebration of Mass, but in little private chapels where people could pray in front of them quietly and contemplate them. Next slide, please. So this is just a kind of, this is your ultimate luxury devotional image. It's much bigger, it's completely non-domestic in scale, hideously difficult to move, especially without damaging it, but it's still intended as a devotional focus and specifically on someone's tomb. Next slide, please. So we'll look at some detail. We're going to look at the face of Mary from two different points of view. We're going to think a bit about this mother and son thing and why she's holding the body of Jesus on her knee. We're going to look at the body of Jesus itself. And is anybody here medically qualified? It's not because I'm feeling ill or anything, it's just, it may be interesting. And then finally, and mysteriously for a few minutes, sober drunkenness. There's a lot of layers of meaning in this statue. Next slide, please. But before we just do look at the detail, this is a sculpture, not a painting, and it's really important that you get a sense of the 3D nature of it. So I've just got a few photographs to show you from unusual and improbable angles. Next slide, please. So this is above and sort of to Mary's left, our right as we normally would see it in St. Peter's. So you can see there the body of Jesus is sort of draped right around. There's a sort of curve to it, and Mary is sitting on a block of stone at the back. And you can see more clearly than you often can her hands, and in particular the gesture of her left hand. The trouble is, we're not quite sure that that's how Michelangelo did it, because when they moved the sculpture in the 18th century, the workman broke her hand off and all the fingers, and they had to get a very skillful sculptor to recut her hand. And we don't know how faithful he was to the original. So the precise gesture of the fingers is 18th century, not necessarily Michelangelo. So I'm not going to say too much about that, because we may be building on something that isn't right, but her hand is basically kind of open. Next slide, please. From directly above, you can see her hand quite clearly there, and also how the body of Jesus actually twists around. You can also see two black spots on Mary's head. That's not faults in the marble, those are holes which were drilled in the 17th century when somebody thought they could improve on this by putting a great big crown and angels in metalwork over the top of the statue. And so they drilled a hole in Jesus's head and two in the top of Mary's to kind of plug them in and glue them in place. Somebody later realized it was a bit of a mistake. And mostly, we don't look at it from this angle, so you don't get to see the damage that was done. Next slide, please. And we're now round the back, and you can see that it's not exactly as... You're not supposed to see it from this angle, so we don't put all the effort in. We've just got lots of large sort of planes of surface. We don't get all the detail. The detail is from the position you're expected to look at it, because you wouldn't have been able to walk around the back. And even Michelangelo knew when enough was enough. Next slide, please. Now we're coming round to the side, and you can see here how Jesus is at an angle. And he's at an angle so you can see him from where you can see this sculpture, but you also see that how improbable this pose is. I don't know if any of you have tried to move a dead body. Possibly not, and possibly you wouldn't want to admit it if you had, because there might be someone here from the Metropolitan Police who would like to talk to you afterwards. But bodies are heavy, and if you've ever tried just to help somebody stand up who's alive, but physically not quite so able, human bodies are incredibly difficult. They flop and move around all over the place, and they're heavy. And that body should just fall straight off. But it's this very skillful illusion that when you see it from the front, it doesn't immediately strike you as totally impossible, but it's highly improbable. Next slide, please. That's more how we're used to seeing it, but it just helps just to get a sense of the thing completely in 3D. And you start to realize that it's been very carefully arranged to show you what you need to see, rather than just to achieve some natural, historically it must have been like this kind of pose. And we'll start to see what we're meant to see. Next slide. So first of all, the face of Mary. I don't know how many of you have thought this in the past or in the 5 minutes at the beginning. She's awfully young, isn't she? to have a son at least in his 30s, even if she was a teenager, which she could have been when Jesus was born, that makes her sort of late 40s minimum. She's wearing quite well, isn't she? Why? Well, it's absolutely deliberate. Michelangelo is on record as having told people that he'd noticed, being an observant chap, that nuns appeared to age much more slowly than other women. He does not seem to have gone on to say, probably because they don't have to live with awkward husbands and spend most of their adult life pregnant and surrounded by small children, going, "Mum, mum, mum," which takes it out of you a bit. But building on that idea and on the classical tradition that you represent the holy and the virtuous through idealized beauty, Michelangelo believed that Mary would not have aged. So he didn't think that's a nice way of representing what kind of a person. We'll make her beautiful, and that's her inner beauty showing through. He literally believed as a historical fact that Mary would not have aged because she was so intimate and close to God. She'd literally had God incarnate within her body for 9 months and then hugged him on a daily basis for 33 years afterwards. She was so close to God that that would make her pretty much ageless and beautiful. And he believed that as a historical fact, that if you had seen Mary, she would literally carry within her the marks of that intimacy with God. If all you had to do was touch Jesus to be healed, she had been much closer for much longer than that. It would change you. And so this is not just an artistic device. This is, for Michelangelo, a theological truth. She must have looked no more than a fresh-faced girl, and she must have struck people as incredibly beautiful for the whole of her life. Even if she lived to be 90, she would still look like this because of who she was and the relationship she had with God. That's why she looks the way she does. Next slide. So what he's trying to do with that face is tell you who she is and what the impact of being totally, totally intimate with the one who comes to give abundant life, life in all its richness. She is alive in a way that no other human has been. Next slide, please. But there's more to Mary's face just than that youth and ideal beauty. Michelangelo was really, really angry with all the Holy Week art which shows Mary emoting all over the place. Yeah. Oh, my son, tearing her hair, ripping her clothes, throwing herself on the floor. He is horrified by that tradition. It's all right for Mary Magdalene, maybe, and for some of the blokes around Jesus, John and all the rest of them. They can emote if they want to. They're not that close. They haven't fully grasped who Jesus is. But Mary knows. And so he says, Mary isn't like us. She doesn't just react with wild grief. She doesn't do any of this sort of histrionic stuff. Theologically and historically, that could not be true. It's actually a form of blasphemy and heresy. And he's really very strong on it. She has faith, she is close to God, and that will have shaped how she is on Good Friday, even though for sure it's an awful thing to have to watch and that marks her. There is something deeper in Mary, and you have to show it because historically it cannot have been otherwise. Next slide, please. And it's not just him. This is an extract from a sermon by Savonarola, preached in Florence in 1496. Maybe Michelangelo heard it, but if he didn't, he'd heard this kind of thing a lot. So Savonarola said this: "Don't think that the Virgin walked through the streets screaming, her hair wild or with indecent carriage, because she could command her sensible side not to feel pain. She went directly behind her child, but with dignity and great modesty, shedding a few tears. She did not appear entirely sad, but happy and sad, in such a way that people marveled at her, because she did not behave as women normally do." Look, it's a long time ago and it's a bit sexist, but that's what he said. And what he's really about is this idea that, yes, for sure, ordinarily, if you see your son unjustly arrested, tortured, whipped, dragged through the streets and crucified, you probably have quite a strong emotional reaction. But Mary has prepared her whole life for this. She has always known that a sword would pierce her soul, and she knows why, and she knows that this is not the end. This has to be in order for humanity to be saved. And so she already knows where this is going, and therefore she is not totally distraught, because she has a different perspective. It's a bit like us. If we celebrate, if we do things on Good Friday, we know Easter Day is the day after tomorrow. And we know when we're remembering the crucifixion, well, you can't unknow the story of the resurrection. So you don't feel as bad as you would otherwise. I have vivid memories when I was a curate years ago in South London. We did a Good Friday service. And because there's all these readings about all the terrible stuff that's happening to Jesus, and there was a local lady who had a little bit of a problem with alcohol, and she was sitting in the front, and partway through the service she just jumped up and said, "You're not telling them the truth," and then just said, he rises from the dead, don't worry. And this is the same sort of thing. Mary knows where this is going because she's so close to God. She understands, and therefore you should not show her as if she doesn't, because that's denying her relationship with God. So not only does she look ageless and beautiful, she looks like a person of real faith, and therefore she is happy and sad. Next slide, please. And you kind of see that in the face. When you really look at Mary's face, there's a sense of sorrow, but also a sense of peace, of acceptance. There's almost a smile on her face, almost. It's as subtle and elusive as the Mona Lisa, if not more so. This is a face that is trying to capture the absolute essence of Christian faith, the sure and certain hope. And she doesn't have to wait for Easter Sunday because she already knows God. Next slide, please. So let's think then about the relationship, mother and son, and the link that I've mentioned earlier in Lent between the crib and the cross. So, to Michelangelo and his circle, the death of Jesus, if you like, consummates the incarnation. It only begins with the Annunciation and with Christmas. God's full embrace of humanity is only complete when Jesus shares our experience of death. So, to bring that out in both Christmas nativity pictures and the Lamentation, the Pieta images, they deliberately echo one another so that you understand this incarnation connection. And more than that, Michelangelo, like Luther, lives and breathes what you can call the theology of the cross. What does that mean? Well, it means that Luther was very big on this, but it wasn't a new idea. It had been around for several centuries at least, especially in the Franciscan movement. The idea that faith really begins when you see Almighty God in the crucified Jesus. Luther has a go at what he calls theologians of glory, which are people who want to focus on the power of God and the Almighty God and creation and all the rest of it. And Luther says, sometimes using deliberately sort of shocking language, it's when you see the nature of God in the complete contradiction of what you might imagine God would or should be like. So all this high, mighty, sitting on a throne stuff, there's no knowledge of God in that. The cross, the cross, the cross. When you see the broken body of Jesus, then you see what God is like, because you realize this is done in love for you. And God has no expectation or demand on you at all. God is giving, giving, giving. And so it's in this moment that you see and understand what God is like. So what we're seeing in this image is an image of the incarnation and of the love of God. Next slide, please. This is another Bellini from Venice, not that different in time. And you see here we've got the baby Jesus on his mother's knee. But the baby looks like he's dead, deliberately so. His eyes are closed, he's very, very still. And there's all sorts of imagery in the background we don't have time to go into, which is making this sort of point that this, it's the transition from winter to spring. It's all about the seasons of the year, and there's birds eating snakes and all sorts of stuff in the background. It's all symbolic. But this is trying to connect the baby in Mary's arms with the dead body of Jesus and the Pieta image, and they deliberately echo. The only reason that Jesus is the other way round on the Pieta figures is because traditionally the spear wound is on his right-hand side, and if he's put that way round, you won't see it, and you need to. So they put Jesus the other way round so that you can see all the wounds. But otherwise, they're very much intended to mirror each other. And the more you look at nativity pictures, the more Good Friday imagery you will find. There's famous Rembrandt paintings of the nativity, which are indoors in a barn. Look in the barn and you will see ladders propped up on wooden timbers, crossed timbers in the structure of it's laden with symbolism to point you to Good Friday. Good Friday and Christmas go very, very closely together in this Western tradition of theology and spirituality. Next slide, please. And so here we have Mary cradling the body of her son in her arms. Mary's quite big in this sculpture. She's bigger than Jesus. If you try to work out, it's very carefully hidden under lots of drapery so that it doesn't look too silly, but she is bigger than Jesus. Did Michelangelo think she really was? No, but it's a subtle way of sort of reminding you of the infant on her knee. And also it makes it slightly less improbable that she can't manage the weight. It's a very, very clever balancing act so that you don't spend all your time thinking, she couldn't do a thing like that, and actually get beyond that to think about the deeper meaning of this particular work of art. So partly this is the mother with her baby, designed to remind you of Christmas and to see the depth that's in all of that incarnational way of thinking about God. Next slide, please. But now we have to think about the body of Jesus itself. Jesus is dead. But though Jesus has died on the cross, God can't die. And this is the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity. And the second person of the Trinity cannot cease to live. And yet Jesus is dead. So artistically, this is the really big challenge. This is horrendous for an artist. How do you show the humanity and divinity of Jesus when Jesus is dead? Because if you just show a smashed up human body, where is the divinity in that? But you can't show God dead. So you've got to somehow, again, try and balance the message so people understand what they're looking at. And the solution at this time, although it went out of fashion because, like often, people thought it was too dangerous, was two things. The healing of the wounded body, so giving the dead Jesus immediately a kind of glorified spiritual body, and secondly, the Latin word they use is the vestigia, the vestiges, and we'll see what those are in a minute. Next slide, please. So this is just a couple of bits of evidence to show I'm not making this up. So this is from, the first bit is from a quote from a description of the body of Jesus as his body is taken down from the cross in an early 16th century tract by an Italian monk called Pieta da Lucca. The dead and wounded and deformed body of the Lord in one instant was made once again healthy, pure and white, as if he had never received a wound or blow. And the idea is it's a bit like, it's like those birthday cake candles that you blow out and it just comes straight back again, and you blow it out again and back again it comes. The idea is that the life of Jesus is snuffed out on the cross and bang, it's back again. You can't kill God, and this body is bound to all eternity to God. And so you cannot snuff this out, and it keeps popping back. And so instantly, as they take the body of Jesus down from the cross, suddenly the body is changed. And people really believe this at this time, really passionately believe it. And then the second bit at the bottom, Vittoria Colonna again, 40 years after this sculpture's made, but these ideas are in circulation the whole time. She was a poet in her own right and a writer, and she wrote something called Pianto sopra la passione di Cristo. And in it, she talks about Mary holding the body of Jesus, so the Pieta scene, and she's holding it, Colonna says, so close that washed and warmed by her tears and embrace, the body appeared alive. So there's two things. It keeps kind of, the life of God is there, and also the body is warmed and washed by Mary's presence. So there's her love and God's love, and together the body is transformed. And this is what Michelangelo has sculpted. Next slide, please. First of all, if you look on this picture, you see the wound in the side. But that was done 10-15 minutes before with a spear thrust in the side. But it looks more like a scar. And where are all the marks from the whipping and beating and kicking? They've all gone. And we'll see the nail marks in a minute, and it's very much the same with them. Next slide, please. There's not a mark on that body. Not a mark, not from the crown of thorns, nothing. Any doctors, medics, nurses, anybody spot anything weird? Okay, next slide. It's pretty clear in this one too, but here you can see Jesus' hand, his right hand, and you can see the mark of the nail, but again, it's almost healed up. just literally moments after the nails have been pulled out, and it's almost healed up. And again, there's something very weird about that hand and that arm. Any offers? Okay, next slide. Now it really hits you. Once you've seen it, it really hits you. Look at his arm. Can you see the veins? They're deliberately accentuated. Strictly speaking, as I understand it, veins can only be raised like that when there's blood pressure. But he's dead. So you shouldn't see that at all. But you see the veins, and these are what they call the vestigia. We show a dead body with blood pressure, so it's not dead. And yet he is dead, but it's God's body, so God's body can never really be a corpse. So we're pointing already to Easter. Yes, he's dead, but I'm showing you what Mary is seeing. I'm showing you that he's not gone forever. His life has not been snuffed out, because this human body, this human person, is eternally united with the undying God who's of steadfast love, who will never let him go, nor Mary go, nor any of you looking go. And I'm being really daring by showing Jesus' body almost as if it's not dead. Now, the trouble is, of course, people might go, oh, look, he's not really dead, is he? And not being educated in the Medici household with great humanist scholars as teenagers, they would go off saying, well, it's how he rose from the dead, isn't it? He wasn't really dead. So it was all a bit of a con. So you start to get people in the 16th century saying, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. The ordinary person in the street, they won't understand. They'll get hold of the wrong end of the stick, and you're really dangling it for them. And people were a lot more used to seeing corpses than we are. So it fades out. But in this period, it's really, once you start to spot it, it's everywhere. Next slide, please. And you notice here, the veins are raised in this picture too, but also because he's holding his hands. Nobody is holding that arm across his chest, but he's not laid out flat. The body is being held upright. So how does that arm come there, and how does the hand catching the blood work then, if he's dead? Everybody knew he was dead, and yet. Next slide, please. So when we look at this picture, we see that that arm with all those very obvious veins has been deliberately put right down where you can see it. Look at my arm. And the wounds are very visible, but only as scars. And so suddenly, this picture is, the picture of this sculpture gives you is of the resurrection. This is an Easter image, not just a Good Friday image. This is screaming life at us. Next slide, please. And yet there's something more, and something in its way even weirder. Because in the Medici household, he heard people talking about Greek and Roman mythology and all this sort of thing, but they got really excited with it, and they're kind of playing with all the ideas and images, and they get very taken with the classical image of the god of wine, Bacchus. And Bacchus has this strange paradox that his power, through the intoxicating effect of alcohol, involves his own weakness and vulnerability, because he drinks a bit and then collapses all over the place. And so you have this idea of power and weakness. And they thought, it's a bit like God, isn't it? A bit like Jesus. I wonder what we could do that would be really intellectual and clever with that. And because it wasn't just new at this period, it goes way back. Because people have this idea that also, and this is in the Bible, that spiritual ecstasy, the power of the Holy Spirit, could also be linked to drunkenness. Not literal alcohol indulgence, but this idea that you would look as if you were drunk. Remember the Pentecost story, when they're all speaking in tongues, they're all filled with the Holy Spirit, and then people say, oh, look at that lot, it's only 9 o'clock in the morning, they're drunk as lords. So the idea is that somehow the image of being drunk on alcohol, on wine, is also something you can borrow as a metaphor for being caught up in the power of God. And you find lots of early Christian writers, Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, Augustine, Jerome, use again and again this metaphor, linking the idea of the wine of the Last Supper, which becomes the blood of Christ shed on the cross. And people are drinking it and then becoming a sober drunkenness, they call it, intoxicated with God, full of the power and life of God. Next slide, please. Jerome, in his commentary on Psalm 80, even says, Dominus in passione inebriatus est, and you don't need to be a Latin scholar to work out that that means our Lord in his passion was drunk. But he doesn't mean literally that he'd had a few at the Last Supper and so didn't really notice what was going on. What he means is that Jesus is so caught up with the love of humanity, pouring out his life for the world, that it's like a sort of intoxication. And in Michelangelo's circles, they develop it even further because Ficino, who he will have known very well, and Erasmus, other humanist scholars around Europe, write about the idea of spiritual intoxication, which makes you feel that you're lifted out of your body and that your body is, to all intents and purposes, to other people around, it looks like you've dropped dead. You're still and motionless, but wrapped in God. And that's what he's sculpting. Because Mary and Jesus, their eyes are not closed. Mary's eyes are not wide open, they're sort of half. And he's trying to show, and so are Jesus's eyes, that the two of them are in a sort of Eucharistic ecstasy. There's literally shared suffering, but shared joy, shared sorrow. Their half-closed eyes are expressing this idea that they are so caught up with one another, they're oblivious to the rest of the world. Jesus is dead and yet not fully dead because he's God, and God is devoted to humanity, and Mary, who represents always the church, is totally intoxicated with God, sorrowful and yet joyful. And we remember in this idea of compassion that line from Galatians, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And that is the very heart of the spirituality of the Pieta. It's about this intense connection between Mary and Jesus, so that almost that Mary is sort of so drunk with the Holy Spirit that she gets through Good Friday with a smile on her face. Next slide, please. That's the face of Jesus. The funny stuff around is scaffolding, because the only way you could get a straight-on look at Jesus is by being kind of suspended over the sculpture. But when you look at the face of Jesus, you see that, like Mary, there's almost a smile playing around his lips. His eyes are not fully closed. There's not a mark on the head. Again, for Michelangelo, it's an image of idealized, ageless male beauty and a sense of deep peace. It's finished. We've done it. Humanity is saved. Next slide, please. And the last one. Last slide. So there are layer upon layer upon layer of quite difficult quite intellectual meaning put into all this. And yet you can express it very simply, which is just to say that this is a sculpture about God's self-giving and Mary's full understanding of that, her reception of God's love and her returning of that love. It then becomes an image of hope placed deliberately on a tomb, so that when you look at this, you think, yes, but there's Easter, and yes, but there's Easter for the cardinal who's buried underneath it, and there'll be Easter for me too. What I need to do is to get what she's got, to be like that, to have the intensity of that relationship with God, not because that earns me a place in heaven, but because that earns me peace and the ability to give and share that love of God in this world. Thank you.
Is it switched on?
How long do you want for tea? We're going to have teas and coffees now, about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back for questions and answers. So we'll get the teas and coffees ready.
You say no, that's... We've got a troublemaker here who said no. That's absolutely... You can stay there if you like, it's not a problem. But if you wouldn't mind taking your seats and we can take some questions and or any observations that you've got. Thank you. Yes, sir. You can take them anywhere you like, but just make sure it's in the church. Can't get these pews out through the door, I've tried. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Sorry to drag you away from your coffee and your chat. I hope many people's mind maybe has been blown by what we've learnt this evening. Just thank you so much. Very, very challenging. So thank you. Thank you for the talk and for what we've learnt and been shown. Anybody, any questions, any thoughts, any reflections? We have got the microphone going round as usual, so if you just wait until you get the microphone. Thank you. Oh, hang on a second. Try again, sorry.
Yeah, working now. Yeah, many thanks for the whole series, most informative, and thanks to St Albans for hosting. Could you just say a little bit about how you became an art historian? You know, what sort of study you did and how you sort of chose these pieces?
I'm a priest first, and in terms of historical order, the art history came second, and is, I suppose, essentially, I always had an interest in art and architecture, but not a very educated or informed interest. I was just telling someone in the break, my mother-in-law had quite a few art history books, and when I used to go visit her and my wife, well, she wasn't my wife then, I used to sneak off and read the books because I hadn't got any access to anything like that at that time. And then gradually over the years, I've just studied more and more things. 20 odd years ago, I was appointed to the cathedral in St Albans to run the adult education. And so I just sort of I said to people, you know, what do people like? And they said, oh, they love art and architecture sort of lectures. So I thought, oh, I can invite people, or I can put myself down for next term to do a lecture on, and then I'll have to. It's my job to be prepared for that. And so I kind of, just over 20, 30 years, have built up knowledge and gone to look at the real thing when I can, which is always a very different experience than just looking at pictures. But I've always been interested in the meaning. You know, why does it look like this? Why did the artist make it like this? And I'm very much focused on Christian art, I guess, which I suppose is Christian subjects, but not necessarily always produced by Christians, or at least sometimes by some rather shaky ones.
Just a little reflection when you said about Mary not showing signs of distress or tears. I just thought about Jesus and the time that he raised Lazarus from the dead, and it said Jesus wept and he was overcome with emotion. So it's just a contradiction. It's just a reflection.
Yeah, except it depends who he was crying for. Sermon time. No, I shall try not to. But the story of the raising of Lazarus is John's Gospel's equivalent of the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus knows that if he acts, then his arrest and execution is inevitable, and he does not have to, but he does. And the emotion that he shows is not weeping for Lazarus or his sisters, it's the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane moment. Because in John's Gospel, he's arrested in Gethsemane, but there's no agonizing beforehand, because he's already done that and accepted where the road is going.
I found thinking about the possibility that Mary was at least aware or had an inkling of what would happen in 3 days' time, that she did know that the resurrection was coming. How does that affect our Lord himself? Did he know? Well, St. John certainly thought he knew, but how does that affect the completeness of his self-offering?
I guess the thing is that at one level he knows, but at another level, does he? You know, it's not that different from, Augustine's famous "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." It's that sort of sense that as a Christian you say, yes, of course I believe in the resurrection, and of course I believe in life beyond death. I just don't want to die yet. There's lots of things I'd still like to do, and you're sort of clinging to the even surer and certain reality that I'm alive now. And then it's the testing moment, and it's, how do we enter into that? I mean, you look at all the ink that's been spilt over the my God, why have you forsaken me? The cry of dereliction, we call it, on the cross. But is it? Majority tradition says yes, that he feels abandoned even by God, but then he is God incarnate, so how can the Trinity be pulled apart? And yet, is it just a matter of, some people have said, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's just saying, oh, Psalm 22, lads, and read it right to the end. It's all right. But that isn't quite the feel of it, somehow. And I think, maybe one day we can actually sort of sit down and say, how was it on the cross? But at the moment, we don't know that. And I don't think any of the gospel writers really knew. They knew what had been seen and heard. But it's part of that mystery of the incarnation. But I think the self-offering in love, I suppose theologically, it might have hurt less, but it's the self-emptying of God, which is there right from day one, right from the Annunciation onwards. And what it was actually like to be Jesus, I don't know. I don't think we can.
Perhaps I can just make the same comment I did over coffee. Was there any knowledge of what Michelangelo thought about this when he'd finished it? I'd understood that when he finished the David, he hit it with a hammer and said, now speak, as if he'd made reality. And I was just wondering, when he saw this, it's such a perfect example. Well, you can't imagine it just being made out of a block of marble. It looks so alive.
I think he was quite pleased with himself. But then he hated that. The famous story about what happens afterwards is that he didn't sign it. He never ever signed any of his works through his career, except this one, but not immediately, because the story is that he was hanging around in the chapel of St. Petronilla watching for the punters. The people are coming in and, ooh, look at that. That wasn't here last week. What do you make of that then? And people are admiring it, and he's sort of thinking, I did that. Yeah. And then they say, who carved it? And someone says, I don't know, but I think it was. And they got the wrong name. Everybody's saying it was some other guy. And he was so annoyed that he was supposed to have gone off, got his chisel and hammer and carved. You can see Mary's got almost like a sort of belt or sash coming across her upper body. And it's not very clear on this one, but if you zoom in, is carved across that is Michelangelo made this. And then he went off and then was mortified at the pride and arrogance of what he'd just done and never, ever, ever signed anything again because it wasn't about him. That was he had a sense that this is my vocation, I am serving God, it's not about the sculptor, the painter, it's about the work and what that does. And so it doesn't matter if no one knows who made it, so long as the message is communicated. But he was 22 and he'd just produced one of the all-time classics of Western art, and I think he's entitled to be slightly pleased with himself.
Any more?
Thank you. In its present context, in the new St. Peter's, is it still associated with the tomb of...
Don't think...
Is it just sort of... I was trying to remember. I mean, I've seen it in St. Peter's, but I can't remember what the context is of anything immediately around it.
I don't think it is. I mean, the problem was the old St. Peter's was falling apart. They had to do something. They replaced it, but the new building is totally, totally different in size and scale and layout from the original. And I don't think very much was carried across. So the Cardinal's mortal remains around there somewhere, but I don't think they're associated with the sculpture anymore.
Right.
And as I say, I think it helps to know that it was intended to mark a burial, to understand some of the meaning of it, because it's about it. I mean, it works independently, but you see why the Cardinal picked that subject and probably helped Michelangelo think through what he had to bring out in the sculpture.
Okay, well, I think that's we've come to the end, really sadly, of our Lent lectures for this year. I'd really like to thank Iain for the 5 that he's done. They've been thoroughly enjoyable. Also, we need to thank people who've provided the refreshments each Tuesday evening from the different churches, from Churches Together. Alan, who's done all the AV stuff for us, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Yeah, without you it wouldn't have been possible. Gillian for the publicity design, apparently. Is Gillian here this evening? No? Okay, well, we do thank her, so we send her a round of applause. And obviously, St Albans for actually allowing us to have this here. So I would like to just give Iain, before he closes, a round of applause, and really we are very, very grateful, so thank you. And then just to remind you that we have our last Lent lunch on Saturday at 12 noon here. So please, if you can join us for a simple lunch, it would be really wonderful. And if you want to drive over, Iain, you're more than welcome. But I doubt that. I'm sure you'll be really busy. So would you just like to close with prayer for us? Thank you.
Let us pray. Father, on our journey through Lent, you have helped us enter into the mystery of Christ's sufferings, that by following in his way, we may come to share in his glory. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.